If you had to guess, what would be your guess?
Guessing won't be necessary.
If you had to guess what the jurors heard over 13 months, 4 women and 8 men, what would be your guess? If you were the prosecutor in this case, what evidence would you present to a jury?
I got nightmares in my head, I fear thoughts build up until I can't feel. My mind fills up into a creature, and it haunts me somewhere much deeper. I got nightmares in my head, I fear.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. Well, if you have your TCRS notebooks, what I want you to do now, and this is quite important, this will be a really good way to gauge your knowledge of the Ramsey case. I want you to write down 7 items that you think the grand jury voted on, the 7 items that are the strongest pieces of evidence in your view. Do that now. And then I want you to compare that to the list of items mentioned in this analysis. If we overlay the theories of the 2 detectives at the center of this case, Steve Thomas and Lou Smith, both resigned, yet only one testified, it's clear that we can boil down the investigation to 7 major pieces of evidence. Lawrence Schiller distills and describes these major items near the end of Perfect Murder, Perfect Town. It's probably the most definitive book on this case. I'll put a link to his book in the description. On page 746 or thereabouts, he starts off with major evidence item 1, a pubic hair found on the white blanket covering JonBenet. Now, before we get to the rest of this analysis, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. If you haven't ordered or if you don't have one of the TCRS notebooks, a brand new one has recently been published. It might make a good Christmas present either for yourself or someone else. I'll put a link to that in the description. If you're finding this analysis worthwhile, please like, share, leave a comment. You can also hit the thanks button and let's get started. Now, please note, this is going to be a fairly quick glossing over of the 7 major evidence items presented to the grand jury. We can obviously dig a lot deeper into these items, going through them one by one in a separate analysis.
Worth playing for? Yeah.
Major evidence item number 1, a pubic hair found on the white blanket covering JonBenet. Now, according to Schiller in Perfect Murder, Perfect Town, there was a lot of uncertainty surrounding this hair. What kind of hair was it? And was it even a pubic hair? And so there was so little hair left after previous tests. So they'd done testing on the hair and they just couldn't figure out what it was. But if they were going to do the most important test, a mitochondrial test, that would actually destroy what remained. According to Schiller, some of the detectives believed that the hair belonged to some family member, but the couple's attorneys had objected to doing the destructive test at this time. Now get what's going on there. The detectives want to test the hair, find out who it belongs to, but the couple's lawyers are saying, no, we don't want you to do the test. And think where we are now, where John Ramsey is complaining that the Boulder PD won't do tests at his behest. They go on to say they insisted that it should be conducted only when a suspect had been matched to other elements of the crime. And of course, no one, including the Ramseys, had been conclusively matched to any element of the crime. Quite interesting, isn't it? So here we have an identical situation to the DNA conundrum, which is if you do a test prematurely, you destroy the evidence while potentially depriving yourself of an actionable sample or result. By the way, they did ultimately test that result. Now, the narrative around the pubic hair is quite interesting. Allow me to briefly touch upon a few points. Number 1, in early 1997, the Colorado Bureau of Investigation, that's the CBI, reported to the police that a pubic hair or some kind of hair had been discovered on the white blanket found around JonBenet's body. When viewed under a compound microscope, the hair showed a high degree of buckling or twisting and a greater degree of curl than chest or scalp hairs. That's according to Schiller. Now we jump to mid-1998. They're still trying to figure out what is going on with this hair. It still had not been identified when the police made their two-day presentation. According to Steve Thomas, the CBI and Cellmark labs weren't sure if it was a pubic hair after all. But testing froze at this point because Team Ramsey insisted on being present in the lab. That's according to the DA's office. Number 3, Lou Smith gave a deposition during a defamation case involving the Ramseys. On the record, he shared what he thought about the pubic hair evidence. This is what he knew up until August 1998 when he resigned from the investigation. It's clear that at the time that Smith left, testing of the hair had not taken place. And so this is what Smith said during the deposition. It has been described as a pubic hair or auxiliary hair, and that would suggest very strongly to me that it probably is from a male. Someday they will be able to match that hair with someone because they are with mitochondrial DNA. The new testing procedures they've got, we will be able to positively identify the source of that hair. And if it belongs to our killer, that will be the strongest piece of evidence. Well, it didn't turn out to be the strongest piece of evidence. Ultimately, the type of hair was identified and it was traced to a particular individual. This occurred well after the grand jury investigation, but suffice it to say, that individual didn't turn out to be the intruder. If you want more information on this right now, I have provided some information on Patreon. And that brings us to major evidence item number 2, shoe print beside JonBenét's body. Now, think about the criticism of the Boulder Police Department and this mythology that the police only focused on the Ramseys in light of this evidence. Ron Gossage had compiled a list of more than 600 people who had been in the Ramseys' house during the 6 months prior to JonBenét's death. If that sounds like a lot, well, they had like a historic homes tour, and so that is why a lot of people visited the house. He had gotten in touch with more than 400 of these people, and not one of them had ever worn or owned that kind of high-tech hiking shoe. Imagine speaking to 40 people and asking them about their footwear, and then another 40 people, until you've spoken to over 400 people. Schiller refers to the size of the shoe that couldn't be determined from the imprint, since the poon is the same size in all shoes. That's that little insignia that shows the brand, the high-tech logo. Now, unlike the hair, the owner of the high-tech shoe print was identified during the grand jury investigation. And we know the identity of that individual thanks to some very unusual and intriguing information that came out about that. Suffice it to say, that individual didn't turn out to be the intruder. Major evidence item number 3, the basement window. Now, according to Schiller, the window had been left open, there was a scuff mark on the wall under it, and pieces of glass had been found on the suitcase just beneath it. We've dealt in depth with the basement window, so I don't really want to cover that same territory again here, at least not exhaustively. What I will say is I don't really like what Schiller has done here. It's not clear that the window was open. If it was, accounts vary. John said it was open less than an inch and that he latched it. This was early in the morning. Elsewhere it appears to be wide open. Others thought that it was closed. Also, the amount of broken glass found beneath the window didn't correspond to the amount of glass missing from the window to begin with. In addition, if the window was broken from the outside inwards, why was a small rectangular fragment found not on the floor inside, but on the windowsill, bearing in mind that the window opened inwards, away from that sill? It's also fascinating the role that a spider's web played in the evidence examined. Think of the detail we're dealing with here. The type of spider, the behavior of an arachnid, right? Also think of the other detail we've dealt with, the hair on the blanket, the shoe print, both at ground zero of the crime scene. This spider web is also very close to the crime scene as well, and yet the DA has the temerity to suggest that there was insufficient evidence, that there wasn't a lot of evidence. What is clear during Smith's demo is that if there was a spider's web to begin with, and we know there was, then a man entering through the window would have filled the entirety of the window and pulled the web off onto his clothing. If you want to make the case that a spider in the middle of winter quickly respun a tattered-looking web moments after it was destroyed, while that's possible, it's highly doubtful. The grand jury, I think it's safe to assume, accepted that the spider narrative seriously undermined the basement window as an unforced entry point. In other words, they rejected the window narrative, which is why they rejected the intruder theory outright. Major evidence item number 4, unidentified palm prints. Did you know about that? A palm print found on the door to the wine cellar. That was a full palm print. There's also a partial palm print on the note of the ransom note. The print on the door had not been matched, according to Schiller, to anyone whose prints were taken for this case, and the National Crime Scene Fingerprint Database didn't include palm prints. Clearly, the print on the door did not belong to John or Patsy Ramsey. Now, the palm print was later identified, and suffice it to say, that individual didn't turn out to be an intruder. Anyone know who it did belong to? We very seldom hear her name when talking about this case. That brings us to major evidence item number 5, foreign DNA. According to Schiller, the fifth element was the stain on JonBenét's underpants containing mixed or foreign DNA. I think it's very important to be clear that it's not just foreign DNA, it's mixed foreign DNA, which means you could be dealing with a composite sample. The first component was JonBenét's. Testing showed that the second or possibly third component did not seem to match either parent or any relative. So look at what we're dealing with. A sample that contains JonBenet, then there's a second sample, and then there's possibly even a third. So they can't tell whether they're dealing with 1, 2, 3, or even more people. So can you see there's a lot of uncertainty surrounding this DNA aspect. And so in the fuzzy, foggy 13-year aftermath to the grand jury finishing its work, it was suggested that the DNA evidence exonerated the Ramseys, or else that the DNA evidence wasn't part of the grand jury trial. Well, you can see that it was. And so if you made that argument, you could say, well, the grand jury trial was there wasn't sufficient evidence, and so it needs to be updated. Meaning the grand jury trial was just an artifact, an outdated legal fossil in dire need of refreshing and updating. Just think about the pageantry and the innuendo and the just how misleading that whole narrative actually was. Because actually DNA evidence, as you can see, was presented, and suffice it to say the grand jury weren't convinced the Ramsey case was solely a DNA case, and certainly they weren't convinced by the DNA aspect of the intruder narrative. The fact that we're distilling this down to 7 items should also show you that the DNA is only one part of it, and I would argue quite a small part of it. Major evidence item number 6, Lou's contribution. Now it's interesting that Schiller describes this as having very little support. Nobody even tried to have JonBenét's body exhumed in order to test his theory. Now, I've already dealt with Lou's theory, but this is what Boulder Police Chief Mark Beckner said about Lou's theory. These are his thoughts. Was a stun gun used? He says no. The coroner and others who looked at the abrasion did not believe that it came from that device. Why? Well, the distance between the two marks did not match the probes of any of the devices that they found. Also, he talks about these devices making loud noises and they inflict painful wounds, which would have led to a response, someone screaming. And then the most obvious one, major evidence item number 7, the ransom note. But there's something about the ransom note evidence that you may not have considered. Let's go back to Schiller. Did Patsy write the note was a question that handwriting experts were battling over. So that was where they were focusing. Who wrote the note? We're not sure, but could Patsy have written the note? And then they decided one way or the other. But nobody could say for sure. Even more mystifying, the ransom note itself showed no fingerprints or signs of handling, no creasing, no damage. Patsy said that she saw the 3 sheets of paper comprising the note spread across the entire width of a step as she descended the spiral staircase. She said that she stepped over the 3 pages before turning around to read their contents. The pages showed no indication that they had been stepped on. At face value, this seemed plausible until the police recreated the scenario Patsy described. The detectives found it was impossible, while descending the spiral staircase, to skip any of the steps without losing one's balance and almost falling forward. Now, one aspect almost everyone seems to miss with the Ramsey ransom note is that it appears as if the writer was trying to disguise their handwriting. If you look closely, you can see just how the letters like the letter L are sort of jagged and in a very unnatural way. And so if you're trying to compare disguised handwriting to actual handwriting, obviously it's going to be inconclusive. Obviously you're not going to have an exact match. And this disguising of handwriting, if you'll notice, it peters out as the note goes on. But it does seem to indicate quite a creative personality, doesn't it? I mean, the author of the note. Suffice it to say, I think it's safe to assume the grand jury didn't think an intruder wrote the note. We can't be 100% sure of everything the grand jury saw and heard, but I would bet 3 additional aspects were discussed as well. 8. What was the murder weapon? In other words, the cause of the blunt force trauma as well. I think they would have discussed the flashlight, golf clubs, softball bat, etc. Number 9, autopsy evidence, the pineapple. That would definitely have been brought up. Number 10, voices heard on the 911 call after Patsy tried to hang it up. Now you can do your own calculus on how many of these items score a home run in terms of proving the intruder theory versus reinforcing the notion that one or more of JonBenét's relatives was possibly involved either in her death or in possibly covering it up. Now, I'm not going to take it further than that, but if you would like me to discuss one of these 10 items in particular detail, let me know in the comments. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.